Hello and a very warm welcome to today's webinar focusing on our accredited specification for GCSE French, German and Spanish. My name is Judith Rowland-Jones and I'm Head of Curriculum for Languages. Just a reminder here that we're focusing only on our new specifications in this webinar, and any queries about current exams need to come through the normal channels. You'll be emailed a copy of these slides after today's session, and there's a survey for completion which you can fill in at any time during the presentation. The purpose of this session is to give you a detailed overview of the accredited AQA specification and to highlight the things that have changed since the draft specification. We're also going to look at the key differences across boards and, importantly, how we think our assessments will benefit your students and foster a love of learning languages. There are lots of positive changes to share, and also it's important to highlight the fantastic support package planned for AQA teachers, as well as some key dates for you to be aware of. At the end, there will be a chance for you to ask any questions, and Ian, Chloe, Sadaf and Marjana are joining us today from the curriculum team to help you with answers. A summary of the questions will be shared with you later this term. The first few slides summarise the key requirements, which I'm sure you will already be familiar with, but they're included for reference. So this slide summarises the new assessment objectives. These assessment objectives are the same for all exam boards, but how they're applied across the different assessment structure will be different based on the approach taken. And our aim is always to make sure we're assessing students in the right way for the right objective to give them the best chance to show what they can do. This slide just highlights the key points about the grammar requirements, and again, these are the same for all exam boards. The main point here is that it is receptive and productive knowledge in this specification. We will be producing a great resource for you which will summarise the grammar requirements, which will provide you with clarity. SSC's sound symbol correspondences are tested in the dictation and the reading aloud specifically. The next two slides summarise the vocabulary requirements for reference. Multi-word phrases are things like il y a. Students can use whichever pronouns they prefer to meet our commitment to inclusivity, which has been a key part of the development of our new specification. The last bullet point mentions the interactive vocabulary list, which we know lots of teachers are using already. If you haven't seen that, please do have a look, because it really will save you a lot of time in terms of how you want to sort the vocabulary. It's available for all three languages, even though we have not yet submitted German and Spanish to Ofqual, and we were delighted to be able to provide the German and the Spanish draft lists to you in response to the many requests. Some more detail here about the vocabulary requirements for reference. For anyone not familiar, you can review this information post-session in your copy of the slides. Again, some more information about the vocabulary requirements for reference, and this is particularly relating to glossing and proper nouns. So there are no changes to the number of papers, the allocations of overall percentages to papers, or to the grading arrangements in comparison with our first draft. So we have 4 tiered papers, all worth 25% out of 50, with scaling on paper 1 foundation tier only. This table represents the final component weightings, and you can see in red where the changes have been made from our first draft. As you can see, most of the AO3 marks in our assessment are now allocated to paper 4 writing. This was 10% for paper 4 for AO3 in the draft version and 7.5% for paper 2. Our assessment model allocates the highest proportion of AO3 marks of any of the exam boards to the writing tasks. This is with the intention of helping students to perform at their best. Being able to reflect on their use and accuracy of language in their writing tasks is much easier to do in paper 4 than in paper 2 speaking. Students can develop the correct exam technique to check their work carefully in their writing exam and improve their chances of scoring higher marks. This change has also resulted in a fully equal split of AO2 and AO3 in paper 4. So this final assessment model gives a very good balance across the 4 papers in terms of allocation of the different objectives across the tasks. The student experience has been a key focus, as I will explain in more detail as we look at the different papers. This summary of paper 1 is unchanged. In the listening comprehension tasks, students hear each utterance twice with carefully crafted pauses to ensure sufficient time for reading the questions and responding, especially where page turning is needed or where written answers are required. Our decision to keep to 2 hearings of each utterance is based on research and consultation with practicing teachers to create the best exam experience for students. To have 3 hearings of every item in the comprehension questions means a far longer listening exam, which teacher feedback indicated would be very unwelcome, as students already find the listening test an intense and tiring task of concentration for students who are operating in a foreign language. The teachers we consulted felt that any longer for a listening exam was undesirable. The strong view which was expressed confirmed that the tailoring of the pauses was a more important issue, which is something AQA has always done for our listening tests. Feedback also indicated that if students had not understood the extract after 2 hearings with appropriate pauses, a 3rd hearing is unlikely to be any help and simply extends the length of the test, creating additional stress and anxiety for students. It's also very likely that the paper 3 exam will follow paper 1 as it does currently, so that was also a very important consideration in terms of the burden on students. The dictation is, however, heard 3 times in total. The 2 minutes checking time has been added to support students to allow them to check their work carefully before the exam finishes, which was something we were pleased to introduce as a direct result of teacher and student feedback, and we're the only exam board to do this. There have been a few small changes to some of the listening comprehension questions in our first draft, but we were pleased that there were no changes to task types or to the level of demand of the tasks across the different grades. The AQA papers focus on shorter chunks of language to avoid placing a burden on students' memory, and this makes the tasks more accessible, particularly at foundation tier. This helps students move through the paper confidently, avoids them losing their place in the test, and provides clarity on which questions are answered from each piece of language they hear. The dictation has changed. You will recall that we had a scaffolded dictation in our first draft, but this was not in line with the subject content requirements in terms of a short spoken extract because of the amount of scaffolding we had provided. So we now have 4 short sentences at foundation and 5 short sentences at higher, which are transcribed in full. But the way that we have designed our dictation task means that students who struggle, in particular with accuracy, can still be successful. Now, 2 words at both tiers from outside the list will be included, and we are the only exam board to have marks for both AO1 and AO3 in this task. So that's listening and responding to spoken language and knowledge of vocabulary and grammar. Half of the marks are awarded for how well the student has communicated the meaning of the spoken extract, and the other half is how accurately they have transcribed it. In order to have marks for AO1, we couldn't include any scaffolding, but we're confident that with the split of marks between AO1 and AO3, all students can gain marks from this task and feel successful. At each tier, as I said, there are 2 words from outside the vocabulary list, and that will be the same in every exam series. There are no changes to the number of times the dictation is heard, which is 3, and we're going to look in detail at the marking of the dictation task in a moment, as that has also changed significantly, and I'm sure you'll be very pleased to see the changes here. This is just a reminder of the requirements for the listening papers and the recordings, and we will be providing a complete recording to accompany the specimen paper very shortly, including one with 25% extra time, as this is something you have asked us to provide as we do in a normal exam series. Here you can see the short sentence we've set with the 2 words from outside the vocabulary list shown in red. The words chosen from outside the vocabulary list are accessible words with familiar sounds students are likely to have come across as part of teaching and learning. The / shows how the sentence will be split when it is heard in short sections. There is a good range of different sounds within the sentences, and we've really taken on board the feedback around the challenges of French in comparison with the other languages. We know you had lots of questions about the marking of this task and things like accents and how accurate the transcription had to be. We've been able to address these important concerns, and we're going to look now at the way the task is marked. There are some really positive changes we've made to make this task as accessible as possible for students. So this is where there is quite a significant change in comparison to our first draft and a very different approach in terms of the other exam boards. The marking method has changed to levels of response marking grids rather than the targeting of individual words. So for awarding AO1, examiners look across the whole 4 or 5 sentences and make a judgment around how well the meaning of the sentences has been communicated. So this is where the lack of accuracy doesn't impact on meaning, as shown in the French example here. Use of the infinitive makes no difference in terms of communication, so students can be credited. This makes the task accessible to even the lowest attaining students. Gaps in the dictation are treated like inaccuracies, so this encourages students to have a go at all of the words because attempts are better than gaps, and some of it may communicate even if it is very inaccurate. When it comes to AO3, we're not looking for total accuracy, and this means that students can still be rewarded highly even if they make minor errors. And we've classed minor errors as things like wrong accents and minor misspellings like double consonants. Our goal is to design assessments and mark schemes that consider what the student has written and award credit wherever possible. Here we have the criteria for both assessment objectives for foundation tier as an example. Higher tier is marked out of 5 for each assessment objective, and you will be able to see the higher criteria in our specification and in our specimen mark schemes. The use of 1-mark bands and very simple and clear descriptors make marking very straightforward. The criteria were trialled with sample student work to ensure that they could be applied consistently and accurately to a range of student answers, and we're confident in this method of marking in that it rewards students of all abilities, a key requirement of good assessment design. Marking the accuracy like this means that there are no tricky decisions for examiners to make around individual words. For example, how correct does a transcribed word have to be to score marks? We're now going to look at one of the example marked responses from our mark scheme, and you can look at the other student examples with the helpful commentaries and marks in the mark schemes to help you understand how the mark scheme will operate in practice. So we don't have to worry about students getting everything totally accurate in order to score the mark, and this is particularly relevant in French, where the dictation task is more challenging in comparison with German and Spanish. This student, despite missing a bit out in sentence 3 and a few incorrect spellings, still gets 3 out of 4 for AO1. The mark for AO3 reflects the fact that this student struggled with verb formations in 3 of the sentences and some incorrect adjectival formations in 2 sentences, but still gets 2 out of 4 for AO3. So overall, this student scores 5 marks out of a possible 8 for this task. I hope that reassures you that because of the way this task is designed, students of all abilities will be able to gain credit and remove potential anxiety students might have about getting everything totally accurate to score marks. We think it will also encourage those students who struggle to attempt all of the dictation instead of just leaving blanks. So please do have a look at the example marked responses in the paper 1 mark scheme for more insight on how our marking approach positively rewards all students. We're moving on now to look at Paper 2 speaking. So very similar to our current specification in terms of practical arrangements with a 5-week window, but the preparation time is now 15 minutes at each tier. From our past experience and taking into account the trialling we did with students for our new speaking tasks, it was very clear that students benefited from being able to make unlimited notes. We don't make any restriction on the length or the nature of the notes students can make. So if they want to write whole sentences or bullet points or even symbols, they can. What's been important for us to consider during the development is that students have access to whatever helps them to perform to the best of their ability. It means freedom for students, and it's less onerous for you from an admin perspective in terms of having to check that the student notes meet any prescriptions or limits. We're the only exam board to allow unlimited notes in the speaking test. This summarises the speaking test and the 3 different parts. The change from the draft materials here is that the role play now lasts 1 to 1.5 minutes, and we now have an unprepared discussion of 1 photo card which contains 2 photos, and we'll look in more detail at that a little bit later. This summary shows the updated allocations of marks to assessment objectives for the speaking test as a whole, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we look in detail at the 3 tasks. So every student does 1 role play, and every single role play for the AQA exam is a social conversation between 2 friends. Diversity and inclusion has played a key role in our design of this qualification. As a result, we haven't included any transactional role plays to make sure there are no tricky scenarios which some students, especially those from a lower socioeconomic background, may find unfamiliar or difficult to navigate because of a lack of lived experience. So things like the Tourist Information Office, restaurants or hotel bookings, buying tickets or lost property. We're the only exam board with no transactional role plays in our speaking test. The feedback from practicing teachers was that this made the task much fairer and accessible and would remove a lot of the worry students have about being faced with a task they don't really understand or have experience of. So students will be able to go into the test feeling confident that the content of the role play will be something which is familiar from the themes and topics they've studied, knowing that they have the vocabulary and the grammar knowledge to fulfill the tasks. We've used very accessible language in the English bullet points to ensure that they are clear to students. Students can use their notes at any point in the test, and they can write themselves a script if they want to. The teacher role is scripted at both tiers, and that script must not be changed. This is an example of a candidate's role. The change here is that a verb is required now for all 5 tasks to make sure that they're all equal in level of demand. You can see the very clear instructions for candidates in accessible language. All of our role plays use informal address, but if students use formal address, they can, as there is no penalty. You can see the helpful reminder for students that each task needs a verb for 2 marks, and the question mark clearly indicates the question task. It also specifies how much information is required by each task, so lots of clarity for students in their preparation time about what they need to do to be successful. Our mark scheme also makes it clear that once a student has fulfilled a task, any other information they might provide is ignored for marking purposes. So for the second task here, if a student replied, "I play football on Saturdays at the park," the first part of the response, "I play football," fulfills the task for 2 marks. Just football with no verb would score 1 mark. We're now going to look at part 2 of the speaking test, the reading aloud of a text and short conversation. So there are 2 parts to this task, reading the text and then a short conversation consisting of 4 straightforward compulsory questions. As the text is short and consists only of words on the vocabulary list, Students should be well prepared and familiar with the words well in advance of their test. The text is displayed as spaced sentences in a larger font to help readability and legibility. We wanted to make sure that the reading aloud task was deliverable in all schools, no matter their resources, size, or number of students. Students can use their preparation time to write out the reading aloud text if they wish and annotate it, or use any kind of phonetic symbols or notes to help them deliver it. They have 15 minutes in this exam for their preparation, so there is time to do this. They can't annotate the candidate card given to them for the reading aloud task, as this would make it difficult for schools to make sure every student had an appropriate copy and could risk significant waste or security breaches. So we know that one of the other exam boards has proposed a rehearsal of the reading aloud task in the test room in front of the teacher, and some teachers have asked if we'll be allowing this. The many teachers we've spoken to since this was published have said that they are not in favour because of the practical issues this raises. For example, the disruption to the preparation time and how it is managed, especially if moving students between rooms which are not always nearby, some students not being keen on practicing in front of the teacher, the inclusion of the rehearsal on the recording which goes to the examiner. In our speaking test, students can self-correct or restart the reading of the text if they stumble, and it is the final attempt which is marked. So really, they don't need a rehearsal. We're the only exam board to allow students to self-correct or restart the reading of the text. It's also important to note that there was no policy intention from DFE for students to practice this out loud in advance of their test. All of the questions at both tiers are in the present tense and have to be asked as they are written. There are no additional questions which can be asked, so from a teacher examiner perspective, this part of the test is very straightforward and takes approximately 2 to 2.5 minutes at foundation tier and 3 to 3.5 minutes at higher tier. But this is only a recommendation, so when the task is completed, you move on to part 3. Our aim when designing the task was to ensure that students could feel supported during the short, unprepared conversation, particularly when the questions are unseen. The design of our task allows students to keep their copy of the reading aloud text during the short conversation, and if they want to, they can use vocabulary or short phrases from the text to help them formulate their answers. Anything we can do to reduce the stress for students and boost their confidence has been a key consideration for us. Not all exam boards allow access to the text during the short conversation. All of the questions are very accessible, open-style questions which encourage a natural response and cover topic content which will be familiar to students from teaching and learning. The criteria are the same at both tiers, so differentiation is by task, and the response to the 4 questions is marked as a whole, not for individual questions. In the AQA speaking test, there are 5 marks for reading the text and then 10 marks available for the short conversation. So there's a great opportunity here in the AQA test for students to gain quite a few marks responding to some straightforward and accessible questions using the vocabulary and structures from the text if they want to. This is one of the French foundation tier texts, so you can see the very clear layout to support accessibility and readability. A range of sounds is being tested, but all words come from the vocabulary list, so students should be familiar with them. There is clarity for students in that it gives the topic the text is based on to avoid any potential confusion, and also very clear instructions that they need to answer the 4 questions fully. We've done our utmost to support students in this new task. So here are the compulsory questions to go with task 6. They're very accessible and straightforward questions which even the lowest attaining students should be able to respond to. The questions cover aspects of the specification topics which should be familiar to students. Coverage of common question words will be something you'll be able to prepare as part of teaching and learning and exam technique, so students can feel confident in their exam. There are 10 marks available for responding to these accessible and straightforward questions. We're now moving on to part 3, discussion of the photo card, and this aspect of our speaking test has changed quite significantly, and we've made some very positive changes here. Our draft submission had 2 photo cards for students to discuss during the test, and these cards were based on different themes. However, as the photos have to be related, and to ensure that students have plenty of possible content to explore, we've now included 2 photos on each card from the same theme, focusing on different aspects. This removes the risks of students running out of things to say and allows them to focus on one theme in their preparation. In terms of marks, the first 5 marks are for students describing the content of the photos, and the second part is an unprepared conversation. And the unprepared conversation is worth 20 marks. Students can make unlimited notes in the preparation time and read from them during the task. The candidate card just has the 2 photos. Like all exam boards, we aren't allowed to have any questions on the student card. The theme for the photo card will be different to the theme for the reading aloud task, and in total, part 3 lasts between 4 and 5 minutes at foundation tier and between 6 and 7 minutes at higher tier, and that includes both parts, so the description of the photos and the unprepared conversation. So this is an example of a candidate's photo card from foundation tier. So this card is from theme 1, people and lifestyle, so covers identity and relationships with others and healthy lifestyle. Any other content is credited from outside theme 1 during this part of the task. So for example, free time activities like cooking and playing football. So the first question will always be, tell me about the photos, and students can use their notes to respond to this and read from them if they want to. Any relevant content is credited, and an example of content being outside the theme of the photo card could be a picture of some people on a walk, which is allocated to a card for theme 2. A student might say that people go hiking or walking to keep fit or to spend time with friends. So even though that is more like content for the topic of healthy lifestyle in theme 1, it's credited. There's really wide flexibility here for students to say whatever they like, as long as it's broadly relevant to the photos and gain credit for it. This should be a confident start to this part of the test for students of all abilities, because the photos have plenty of content to talk about and they can focus more on one photo than the other if they wish, as long as they say one thing about each photo as a minimum. This description is recommended to last approximately a minute at foundation tier and 1.5 minutes at higher tier. So this is an example of the instructions given on the candidate photo card. It's very clear in terms of what students need to do and helpfully confirms that they can use their notes during the test. It also reminds them that they have to say at least one thing about each photo, reducing the risk of this not being understood or forgotten in the stress of the test and impacting on marks. So this is very student friendly. It then clarifies to students which theme the remaining conversation will focus on, so they know what to expect in terms of the focus of the questions they will be answering. And if they wish to note down any words or expressions which they think are likely to be helpful for the conversation, they can do. So the second part of the photo card discussion requires each student to take part in an unprepared conversation on any or all of the 3 topics within the theme of the photo card. So if a card is on theme 1, then in the unprepared conversation, the teacher can ask questions from any of the 3 topics within that theme at their discretion. This flexibility means that teachers can tailor their questions to the interests and abilities of the students they're testing. They can avoid any potentially sensitive topics for individual students in line with our commitment to inclusion. This format allows all students to show their speaking skills to the best of their ability within the time. Some students may be able to sustain a conversation on one aspect of a topic, whereas a lower attaining student may need to move across different topics to keep the conversation going. This makes it really flexible. There are no requirements around how many topics or how long must be spent on a topic, for example, as we had in the draft. So we think this is a real improvement and will make the test much less stressful for teacher examiners and for students. In terms of marks for the photo card task, there are 5 AO2 marks for describing the photo, but no AO3 marks, which is different to the other exam boards. The AQA test moves straight on to the unprepared conversation on the theme. In the AQA speaking test, you listen to the student describe the content of the photos using their notes, and then once that part is completed, you move straight on to the unprepared conversation. You can ask questions on any of the topics in the theme and don't have to worry about covering specified aspects or covering more than one topic if you don't wish to. Also, 20 out of the 25 marks are for the unprepared conversation, which, as I've said, is extremely flexible. You can be confident you've got the flexibility to allow all of your students the best possible chance to demonstrate their skills. And with most of the marks for AO1 in the unprepared conversation, students can focus on communicating even if they struggle with accuracy. I hope this has given you a good overview of our new speaking test, but you will be able to look in more detail at our accredited materials on our website. So we're moving on now to Paper 3 Reading. So there are no changes to the format of our reading paper. There are some small changes to some of the reading comprehension tasks, but very minor ones. The comprehension questions cover a broad range of different topics and content. We focused on building cultural capital and celebrating cultural diversity within the context of the reading stimulus text to inspire and broaden students' knowledge of the target language speaking cultures and communities. Translation is in sentences rather than a passage at both tiers to make the task more accessible, and it also means students are less likely to miss words out as they may do when the text is presented as a passage. We're the only exam board to have sentences for the translation at higher tier. Just a reminder here of the requirements around the reading paper. Teachers felt strongly that the true, false, don't know task type was too challenging for GCSE and often caused confusion, so we've committed to not using it in any of the papers for listening or reading across the languages. Testing inference is a subject content requirement. We decided to test inference as multiple choice to make this task sufficiently accessible for even lower attaining students. All of the words, apart from the word in bold, are in the vocabulary list, so students have to use their knowledge of those words to infer that it refers to a bedroom, for example. So use of vocabulary items such as to sleep and pleasant dreams help students come to that conclusion. There are 2 inference tasks at each tier, and that will be the same in every exam series. We're moving on now to Paper 4 Writing. So teachers told us that the format of our current writing paper was accessible to students of all levels of attainment, differentiated well between students, and they feel successful. So we've retained as many aspects of our current writing paper where possible. The foundation tier exam duration has increased to 1 hour and 10 minutes, and I'll explain why in a moment. And the overlap question is now question 5 at foundation tier. There is a choice for students in the overlap question and in higher tier question 2, as we have in the current specification. Here you can see how the marks and which assessment objectives are allocated to the different questions at each tier. So you can see that there is a new question which has been added at foundation tier for 5 AO3 marks, and the total marks for question 2 have been reduced to 10 with an equal weighting between AO2, responding to written language, and AO3, knowledge of vocab and grammar. At higher tier, the number of AO2 marks in question 3 has reduced to 15 from 20, and the number of AO3 marks increased to 10. We feel this is a really good balance because it means that the weighting of AO2 and AO3 across both of the papers is equal and more student-friendly, in that accuracy is much more manageable in writing than in speaking because students can reflect on what they've written. So here we have an overview of the structure of the foundation tier writing paper. So question 1 is unchanged. The question 2 marks, as I've said, have been reduced to 10 rather than 15 to reflect the adjustments to the assessment objective proportions I mentioned a moment ago. And we've also increased the number of bullet points in this question to help provide more structure to the task, so we can ensure that we can differentiate sufficiently between students of different abilities at this level. The suggested number of words has increased accordingly to approximately 50 words. A new question has been introduced, which is a 5-mark grammar task. So the reason that we have introduced this additional task for AO3 at this tier is to ensure that we had the correct proportions of AO3 marks in comparison with the higher tier paper. It would have been inappropriate to add more AO3 marks to foundation tier question 2, and the overlap question, as you know, has to be the same at foundation tier as it is at higher tier. So that remains at 10 marks for AO2 and 5 marks for AO3. The foundation tier exam time has been increased by 10 minutes to reflect these changes, and there are some changes to the assessment criteria grids which have also been made, and these can be viewed in the final published mark scheme. So this is the foundation question 3 from French specimen paper. So students need to choose the correct word from a choice of 3 possible answers and write it in the gap. It's multiple choice to aid accessibility. Students copy the word correctly into the gap to score the mark, and that includes any accents. An example is provided to support students and provide clarity on what they need to do. Only AO3 marks are awarded here, knowledge of vocab and grammar. It's a very straightforward task and reflects the aims of the subject content in terms of students demonstrating understanding of grammar. So the small change here is the proportion of marks for AO2 and AO3 in question 3, which, as I said, gives a much better split. Translation is in sentences rather than a passage to make the task more accessible, and also to ensure students don't miss words out, as they may do when the text is presented as a passage. And again, we're the only exam board to have sentences at higher tier. So we're coming now to the final section of the presentation, and I just want to talk a little bit about our teacher support. So our teacher support is focused around 3 key areas: sharing our expertise, providing you with clear guidance and timely support, so we know that that support is really important throughout the year, not just helping you prepare for exams. And thirdly, building a community. So our network is the largest of any exam board, and we want to make sure that we celebrate language learning and that you're going to be surrounded by people who share those same goals, helping students to get the results they deserve. So here is a helpful summary of the planned teacher support for AQA teachers. So you have the specification and the specimen papers, and also those very useful item commentaries which sit alongside the specimen papers and give you that really valuable insight into how the papers have been constructed. You'll also get an additional set of specimen papers to use as mocks. There's the digital vocab list, and we're also going to be producing some extra resources around some of the new tasks. Exam program is going to be updated, so there'll be some progress tests, vocabulary and grammar tests, and the grammar summary resource I mentioned earlier. In terms of launch events, the formal launch events program will take place in autumn 2023, and bookings for those events will be open very shortly. So there will be a mix of online and face-to-face events. Our very detailed Prepare to Teach events will take place in spring 2024, and there'll be a full program, again a mix of face-to-face and online events, which will be led by our subject experts, and these will be language specific. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Oxford University Press. They are the only publisher who will gain an approved status for their textbook, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that now. So this is a summary of the support from OUP. So there will be foundation and higher books for French, German and Spanish for the new specification. There will also be online resources delivered via Google, and these resources won't be part of the AQA approval process. If you subscribe for the current specification, you will get access to both courses during the transition period. And if you're interested in hearing more about the Oxford University Press textbooks, please use the link there to register your interest. So this slide gives you an overview of the timeline and key dates. So you can see here that German and Spanish will be submitted to Ofqual. That will be approximately 4 weeks time. So that's going to be early July, but we will keep you posted on that. As soon as we do submit our draft materials to Ofqual, they will be posted on our website, so you'll be able to download them and have a look. I just want to mention an event that we've got set up for the 11th of July, a deep dive into the new GCSE speaking test. So this will be a free online event, and you'll be able to join and hear much more about the detail of the speaking test. And bookings for that will be open very shortly, so we'll give you some more information on that very soon. We're hoping that German and Spanish will be accredited later this summer, so by September 2023, all of the accredited specifications and specimen papers will be in schools a year in advance of teaching. I mentioned a moment ago our launch meetings at the start of the autumn term, and then spring and summer, the Prepare to Teach meetings. So in September 2024, it's the first teaching of a 2-year GCSE, 2025, June, final exam for the current GCSE, and then June 2026 is the first exam for the new GCSE. Here are our contact details for you to get in touch with us. So our telephone number and the MFL mailbox address. Please don't hesitate to get in touch if there's anything we can help you with. So we're coming to the end of today's webinar, and I just want to leave you with some final thoughts. Why should you choose AQA's new specification for your students? Here are some things for you to think about. A wide range of practicing teachers have shared their opinions on our specification and assessments every step of the way through the development process. We've also asked students what they thought of our themes and topics and trialled our draft assessments with them. It's important that every student gets the grade they deserve. Our assessment criteria was trialled to make sure it was reliable and differentiated effectively between students. We've taken teacher feedback on board in terms of how we've designed our listening comprehension tasks. You told us that it was more important to make sure the test wasn't too long to avoid placing a burden on students in terms of concentration, and that the pauses must reflect the requirements of the task. We've designed our dictation to reward communication of meaning as well as accuracy, so all students can feel confident about being able to score marks. To give students an extra chance to make sure their work is as accurate as possible, we've added checking time at the end of the listening exam. Teachers told us that students find transactional role plays harder, especially if it's something they've not experienced in their life. This is why we've made all of our role plays informal social conversations between friends based on topics in the specification. Students can make unlimited notes in their speaking preparation time. We want to make sure they have whatever they need to be successful. Students are allowed to restart their reading aloud task if they need to, and it will always be the final version that is marked. They can also keep the copy of the text to help them answer the questions in the short conversation. In the unprepared conversation, the teacher can ask questions from any of the 3 topics within that theme. This flexibility means that you can tailor your questions to the interests and abilities of your students. You know your students best, so you can use your discretion to avoid any potentially sensitive topics for students and allow students to really show their speaking skills to the best of their ability. There are no requirements around how many topics to cover or how long must be spent on a topic, so you don't have to worry about stopping and starting timing during the test for each part. You can focus on getting the best out of your students. Our translations at higher tier are sentences, not passages, making them more accessible. Our assessment model allocates the highest proportion of AO3 marks of any of the exam boards to the writing tasks. This is with the intention of helping students perform at their best. So we now move to the final part of today's session, which is the questions and answers. My colleagues will be responding to any questions you have, which can be put into the chat. There are hundreds of teachers on today's call, so we will answer as many as we can, but please don't worry if your question isn't answered. We'll make sure all questions are in our summary document, which will be sent to you in due course. If you don't have any questions, you might still find it interesting to stay and see our responses to questions asked by other attendees. I want to thank you all for coming along today to find out more about the new AQA specification. I hope you found the session useful and informative, and please do get in touch if you'd like to chat to us further or set up a meeting with one of our team. We'd love to hear from you. Have a pleasant evening. Goodbye.